We need a sign up form for our landing view, and we need to get that information when the user submits the form, and we also need to validate that information because we might not have everything that we need in order to create a user. Well, the MVC framework has a feature called model binding, which makes all of this almost trivial. We create a class, which we call a model class. Its properties are named exactly like the fields on the form. And when the user submits that form, the MVC framework will create a model object. It will populate the properties with their appropriate values. And then if we want it to, it will validate that information. And then once we know that we have a valid model, then we can do something with that data. So we're going to get started by adding a folder to our project called View Models. Now there are different definitions of a view model. There's a programming model called Model View Model, or MVVM, and it has its own type of view model. The view models that we are going to use in this lesson are not like the view models in MVVM. The view model, in our case, is simply a model that is specific to a view. You can think of it as a class that its sole purpose is to get information from the view to the controller. So create a new class in this view model folder, and we are going to call it Signup View Model. The properties of this class need to match up with the names of our form fields, but even then we don't have to worry about that because some of the model features within the view will create the form fields with the name of our properties. So all we really need to do is define this class. So there are a few standard things that come with a sign-up form. First of all, we need the username. So this is going to be a string. We need a password, which is a string as well. But we also need a second password because the user needs to verify that they typed their password correctly. We'll call that password 2. And then we need an email address. And we could add some other things if we wanted to, but we can just start with these 4 pieces of information. And now that we have this view model namespace, let's go to our web config file inside of the views folder, and let's add this namespace to the namespaces element. This will allow us to use the view models without specifying a using statement. Well, let's go to our landing view and let's create our form. First of all, we need to strongly type this view because now we are going to be working with an object of type signup view. So we will just use @model and then signup view model. And let's save it and close it so that Visual Studio knows that it needs to pull in our new namespace. Let's open up landing again. And now we have color coding. So inside of this paragraph element, let's have a using statement for our sign-up form equals html.beginForm. We want this to post to the sign-up action on the account controller. And then inside of this form, we simply want our form fields. Let's start with the email address. So @html, we are going to use the textbox4 method, and we want to specify the email property on our model. And this is going to create a text box for that email. And it's going to use the email name for the ID and the name attributes. Let's also pass in an anonymous object that has a property of a placeholder. This is going to set the placeholder attribute on the input element. And let's just set that to email. Next, we can do the username, so HTML and then textbox4. We want to specify the username property on our model, and we will set the placeholder to username. And then I'm going to paste in the rest of the fields because it's just more of the same. Now let's go to our account controller, and let's modify our signup method. This is going to accept an object of type signup_viewModel, and I'll call this parameter model. The first thing we should really do is check to see if the user is logged in. If they are logged in and making a post request to our signup action method, then we need to redirect them to the index. So if security.isAuthenticated, then we will return a redirect to action method. Action is index and the controller is home. Now we don't have any validation code yet, but let's go ahead and validate. We use the model state object and it has a property called isValid. If the model state is not valid, then we want to go back to the landing view, and we want to simply pass in our model. And this is going to display any error messages that the user needs to see. Now, since we are specifying landing here within the account controller, we need to move the landing view from the home controller folder into the shared. That way, this view can be used both here in the account controller and in the home controller. Next, we need to check if the username already exists. So I believe we have a method on our security class. Let's see if we have anything with exist. Yes, does user exist? We can pass in a model.username, and then we want to display an error message. And we can do that with this model state object. We have a method called addModelError. We need to specify the key, which is the name of the field that has an error. So that would be username, and then we can specify the error message. Username is already taken. And then we want to return the view passing in the model. But if everything is okay, then we want to create the user. We'll use our security class and the create user method. And our current create user method really doesn't meet our needs. The current create user method only accepts a username and a password. We have an email. And it would also be nice if we could just pass in our model. So that's something that we could change here in a few minutes. And then after we create the user and log in, then we can return redirect to action, index, and then home. Let's first address this issue because our code definitely will not compile in its current state. So let's go to the services folder. Let's open up user service and iUser service. And that's not it. We want the security service and iSecurity service. We can change our create user method because we're really only using it in one place, our signup action method. So we can replace these two with signup view model, and we can call this parameter signup model. And then let's set the default value for login to true. So in our security service class, we need to also modify create user there. Replace the username and the password parameters with signup view model, and then signup model for the parameter name. Then for the create method, we could use signup model.username and signup model.password for the create method. Then for the profile, we have an email address now, so we can use initializer syntax to set email to signup model.email. And we really need to create the user profile repository in service, but we'll get to that later on. So we have just about everything we need except the actual validation and the error messages to display when validation fails. Well, for that, we go back to our model class. We're going to decorate these properties with some attributes. These are data annotations. So like the username, we can say is required, so that if the user omits username, then they're going to see the error message that we display with the error message property. And the message could be, please enter your desired username. The password property is required as well, but instead of saying please enter your desired username, we'll say please enter a password. The password to property is also required, but we're not going to use the required attribute. Instead, we're going to use compare. This compares the value of the password to property with what other property we specify for this first argument. So by specifying password, then the compare attribute is going to compare those two values together. If they are the same, then validation passes. If they are not the same, validation fails. And for the error message, we can just say that the passwords do not match. We don't really have to use the required attribute for the email either. We have an attribute called email address, which is going to basically use a regular expression to determine if the value for email is a valid email address. And if it's not, then we will use the error message of please enter a valid email address. So if they leave it blank, that's not a valid email address. So validation will fail in that case. And so now everything is ready to go except the index action method in the home controller. So let's go back there. Let's first check to see if the user is not logged in. And if they aren't, then we will go to the landing page view. So if not security is authenticated. Then we want to return view landing, and then we will pass in a new sign up view model because we have to have something that is not null to work with. And we don't have our timeline view yet, so let's throw a new not implemented exception. Okay, so now's the moment of truth. We have we have run our application once, but now let's run it again, and we are going to see if our sign up form works. And we get an error message about less. Why could style.less not be loaded? Let's go to our layout page and let's ensure that the URL is correct. So open up layout. Yes, less.js and style less. So the only other thing is that the built-in web server, IIS Express in this case, doesn't know what to do with a less file. And that's easy enough to fix. Let's open up the web config file for our project, not for the views folder. And we want to see if there is an element of static content. There is not. So we need to find the system.webserver element. So system.webserver, there it is. And inside of this element, we want to add a static content element. And then we want to add a child element to this static content element called MIME map. It has an attribute called file extension. We specify .less, and then the type is text.css or /CSS. So now this should work. Let's run it again. And we didn't get an error. In fact, we see our Ribbit landing page. So let's click create account and let's see what happens. Oh, we didn't do the anti-forgery. So let's go back to Visual Studio. Let's go to the landing view. And inside of the form, we just simply want to call @HTML anti-forgery token. That ought to fix that, so let's execute our program once again. Click on Create Account, and there we have our errors, although we're not seeing anything for email. Let's put in some text for email. Well, it appears that a blank value passes the email validation, so we do need a required attribute on our email property. So let's go back to our signup view model, and let's add a required attribute. I'm really surprised at that. I would have thought that a blank value would not pass validation. Let's set the error message to please enter your email address. Okay, so we have seen validation fail. Let's try to actually create a user now. So for the email, I'm going to say foo@bar.com, username, JW McPeak, password is going to be password. Let's just test the confirm password, create account, passwords do not match. That's great. So we will type the correct password here. I'm just using password. Let's click on create account, and we got all the way through. So we through this not implemented exception. Let's check the database. Let's see if we have some information here. So fire up SQL Server Management Studio, connect to your database. Let's open up Ribbit database. We have tables, we have follow, we have Ribbits, user profiles. Let's open up users. We should see one record here, and we do. Let's look at the profiles, and we have one there as well with the email. You know, one of the best feelings in the world is when you write a bunch of code and you run it for the first time and it mostly works. So we created a user in this lesson. Now we just need to be able to log them in. And we did log in our user once we created, but you know, if we try to run our application again, we don't have a login form to log in with our newly created user. So we will add that in the next lesson.